The city pulsed with wealth, yet beneath the glittering towers a storm gathered. Jonathan Hale stood in his office as alarms blared from the trading screens. "At all," the narrator said, in a single breath, his empire cracked. Rebecca Clark rushed in and said, "Jonathan, the markets are collapsing, and investors are pulling everything." Jonathan clenched his fists, muttering, "How did it unravel so fast?" Phones rang endlessly, screens flashed red, and employees whispered in panic. The narrator said, "A king's fortress was reduced to ruins before dawn." Jonathan felt betrayal in the shadows, the weight of whispers pressing against him. He looked at the skyline, knowing the city watched every move. The fall had begun, and there was no chance to prepare. The narrator said, by morning, Jonathan Hale was no longer a titan, but a hunted man. Newspapers screamed headlines of fraud and collapse. Rebecca whispered, "They're calling for your resignation, Jonathan." His jaw tightened as he replied, "They'll never strip me of what I built." Cameras swarmed outside, flashing through tinted windows, hungry for a downfall. Investors demanded explanations. Employees fled meetings, and rivals circled like sharks. Jonathan's voice cracked as he muttered, "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning of war." The narrator said, "Every empire falls not with silence, but with thunder." The boardroom reeked of betrayal. The narrator said, "Once allies, now they circled with sharpened smiles." Rebecca Clark said, "The board wants answers today." Jonathan Hale stood at the head of the table and said, "I gave you empires and you repay me with knives." Whispers spread among the directors, men and women refusing his gaze. The air thickened with fear and greed. Jonathan knew the betrayer was already seated in this room, sharpening their dagger in silence. The narrator said, "Whispers escaped into headlines faster than loyalty could hold." News leaks spilled into media channels, exposing confidential plans. Rebecca Clark said, "Someone inside is feeding them." Jonathan Hale slammed the desk and shouted, "Find them now." Screens around the room showed his image plastered with the word, "Scandal." His voice shook with rage as betrayal gnawed at every corner of his empire. Night fell heavy with silence pressing like a stone. Jonathan Hale sat alone in his darkened office as the skyline loomed outside. The narrator said, "Every empire's collapse begins with loneliness." Rebecca Clark entered softly and said, "You still have options, Jonathan, but the walls are closing." Jonathan whispered, "Options are illusions. War is the only truth left." His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. The storm had passed, but the scars were permanent. The fall from grace was complete. The narrator said, "The morning after the collapse, Jonathan Hale faced the cruel theater of the press. Flashbulbs blinded him as journalists screamed questions. Rebecca Clark whispered, 'Say nothing until counsel arrives.' Jonathan muttered, 'Silence is weakness.' His voice cracked as he stepped forward, but the crowd twisted his words into scandal. He raised his hands to speak, yet jeers drowned him out. Cameras captured every flinch, every tremor. The narrator said, "Isolation is not quiet. It is the noise of the world turning its back." Jonathan's shoulders squared as he realized he was no longer the master of the room, but the spectacle of its destruction. The narrator said, inside the boardroom, Jonathan Hale sat in the center of suspicion. The directors leaned in with veiled hostility, their smiles sharpened like blades. Rebecca Clark whispered, "They're testing your weakness." Jonathan replied, "Let them see steel." His gaze locked on Richard Cole, a rival board member with ambition blazing in his eyes. Jonathan said, "Richard, speak your truth or sharpen your knife." The room grew silent, tension rising like smoke. The narrator said, "Every eye judged him not as a leader, but as prey." The narrator said, by dusk, Jonathan Hale's fortress turned into a prison of whispers. Anonymous letters leaked to the media, accusing him of embezzlement. Rebecca Clark read aloud, "They say the numbers don't add up." Jonathan shouted, "Lies crafted by ghosts." He slammed his fist on the desk, rattling the glass. Outside, angry protesters gathered, chanting his name with venom. The narrator said, when loyalty dissolves, the world no longer fears your power. It feeds on your downfall. Jonathan's eyes burned with rage, yet behind them a shadow of fear crept closer. The narrator said, alone at night, Jonathan Hale searched for allies in shadows. He dialed numbers that rang without answers. Rebecca Clark entered quietly and said, "They've abandoned you." Jonathan whispered, "Power attracts many, but ruin attracts none." He leaned back in his chair, staring at ceiling lights that felt like interrogation lamps. The narrator said, "Isolation claws hardest when even silence feels hostile." His phone buzzed once more, a message from an unknown number. He read the words aloud, "We're coming for everything." The narrator said, "The next dawn offered no peace." Jonathan Hale walked into his company lobby, greeted not by applause, but by silence. Rebecca Clark said, "The staff are resigning one by one." Jonathan muttered, "Cowards flee when storms rise." He passed by employees, lowering their heads, refusing to meet his eyes. Security guards shifted uneasily, no longer loyal but obligated. The narrator said, once a king among his people, now he was a ghost haunting his own empire. Jonathan pressed forward, determined that no wall of silence would break his resolve. The narrator said, the vultures began to circle. Jonathan Hale met Richard Cole in a tense hallway lined with glass walls, each reflection multiplying their rivalry. Richard smirked and said, "Jonathan, you've lost the board and soon the rest." Jonathan replied, "You underestimate the ashes." Rebecca Clark warned, "This isn't a meeting, it's a trap." Jonathan's eyes burned with defiance, though his stomach twisted with unease. The narrator said, "Rivals no longer conspired in shadows, they prowled openly." Every step Jonathan took now echoed with the sound of enemies sharpening their teeth. The narrator said, "Trust leaked faster than secrets." An emergency board call revealed hostile whispers. Jonathan Hale entered, every eye fixed with cold precision. Richard Cole said, "We must discuss leadership transition." Jonathan slammed his hand on the table and shouted, "I am still the leader here." Rebecca Clark murmured, "They're siding with him." Jonathan scanned the room, suspicion flooding his mind. The narrator said, "Some betrayals are silent long before they are spoken." Jonathan knew one of his own allies was feeding Richard power from within. The narrator said, "Shadows lurked inside the empire itself." Confidential files vanished, leaked to the press before Jonathan even saw them. Rebecca Clark said, "Someone inside is feeding them directly." Jonathan whispered, "A spy among us." His mind replayed every glance, every half-smile from colleagues. He clenched his jaw and muttered, "Find the rat and I'll cut them out." The narrator said, "A king cannot fight an army when his own guards sharpen blades against him." Trust now became poison, and Jonathan drank it daily. The narrator said, "In betrayal's echo, alliances twisted into traps." Jonathan Hale met with Eleanor Price, an investor cloaked in mystery. Eleanor said, "I can save you, but everything has a cost." Jonathan answered, "I've already lost everything, what more can you take?" Rebecca Clark whispered, "She isn't here for rescue, Jonathan, she's here for leverage." The narrator said, "When unseen forces move pieces, kings become pawns." Jonathan shook Eleanor's hand, but her smile cut sharper than any blade. The narrator said, by night, Jonathan's empire became a battlefield without walls. Protesters shouted below his office, board members schemed above him, and spies whispered inside. Rebecca Clark said, "You can't fight everyone at once." Jonathan whispered, "Then I will fight like I have nothing to lose." His reflection stared back, older and more broken than he remembered. The narrator said, "When enemies move in shadows, survival demands fury." Jonathan tightened his tie, stepped from his office, and embraced the war unfolding around him. The narrator said, Jonathan Hale sought wisdom in forgotten voices. He met Arthur Sterling, a disillusioned mentor who once ruled the same empire. Arthur said, "I built this kingdom, and it destroyed me." Jonathan replied, "Then teach me to survive where you failed." Rebecca Clark warned, "He's bitter, Jonathan, not loyal." Arthur leaned closer and whispered, "Every empire falls from within. Cut the rot before it consumes you." The narrator said in broken men, Jonathan found the map of his own ruin, and his only chance to rise again. The narrator said, advice was a weapon, but Jonathan needed allies. He walked the corridors of power, calling back those who once stood beside him. Rebecca Clark said, they fear association, but some still respect your fire. Jonathan answered, fear bends weaker men, but respect can ignite them again. The narrator said, every step through his deserted halls felt like a campaign march, every nod from an old ally a fragile oath. Jonathan pressed on, gathering fragments of loyalty into the makings of war. The narrator said, the first strike was not in boardrooms but in silence. Jonathan Hale leaked controlled rumors, redirecting suspicion toward Richard Cole. Rebecca Clark said, they'll think twice if Richard is tainted. Jonathan muttered, let him taste the poison he poured for me. The narrator said, in corporate war, whispers cut sharper than swords. Jonathan watched the news tickers turn against his rival, his lips curling in a rare smile. Yet in victory he felt the shadows watching, as if unseen hands still moved the pieces. The narrator said, Jonathan struck harder, reclaiming ground piece by piece. At a shareholders' gathering, he delivered a fiery speech. Jonathan said, I built this empire, and I will not watch scavengers devour it. Applause broke, though laced with hesitation. Rebecca Clark whispered, some still believe, Jonathan. His voice thundered again, those who stand with me will share the victory. Those who don't will be forgotten. The narrator said strength was a mask, but masks when worn long enough can become a man's true face. The narrator said, the counterattack burned bright, but victory invited darker storms. Alone again and in his office, Jonathan stared at the skyline, the weight of fresh battles pressing on him. Rebecca Clark entered and said, Richard isn't finished, he's rallying new allies. Jonathan whispered, then we keep striking until they fall. The narrator said, every win sharpened the knives against him. In the war for power, triumph was never final, only borrowed. Jonathan tightened his fists, prepared for the war that had only just begun. The narrator said, victory carries poison hidden in the cup. Jonathan Hale sat in his office, savoring his small wins, when Rebecca Clark whispered, Richard is striking again, deeper this time. Jonathan said, let him try. I know his game now. Yet as he spoke, an unease stirred. Reports landed on his desk, showing leaks from his inner circle. The narrator said, a fortress built on trust crumbles when the traitor opens the gates. Jonathan clenched the papers, sensing that betrayal was closer than the enemy he could see. The narrator said, trust bled away with every whisper. Jonathan Hale confronted Richard Cole in a heated boardroom exchange. Richard said, you're finished, Jonathan. The numbers and the people are mine. Jonathan roared, I'll burn this empire before I hand it to you. Rebecca Clark said, he's playing for blood. The narrator said, enemies grow bold when shadows hide their allies. Jonathan left the room certain that Richard was not acting alone. The real danger, he realized, sat much closer. The narrator said, the knife always comes from the hand you hold closest. That evening, Jonathan Hale discovered hidden correspondence. Rebecca Clark entered, but Jonathan cut her off. Someone close to me feeds them, he said. Rebecca replied, Jonathan, you can't believe it's me. His eyes narrowed. I trust nothing anymore. The narrator said, suspicion corrodes faster than betrayal, yet both carve deep wounds. Jonathan felt the ground shift as the one person he leaned on most became the question he feared to answer. The narrator said, truth is cruel when it strips away the last illusion. Jonathan Hale burst into a hidden conference where Richard Cole smiled, and beside him stood Rebecca Clark. Richard said, even queens change sides, Jonathan. Rebecca whispered, I had no choice. They would have destroyed me too. Jonathan shouted, you were my shield, and you became my dagger. The narrator said, the most loyal face revealed itself as the sharpest betrayal. In that moment, Jonathan's empire was not stolen by rivals, but shattered by the one he trusted most. The narrator said, "Empires collapse not when enemies strike, but when hearts betray." Jonathan Hale staggered into his office, the weight of betrayal pressing on him. "Alone," he whispered. "Everything I fought for, everything I trusted, it's gone." His reflection stared back, not as a titan, but as a man undone. The narrator said, "Betrayal is the cruelest teacher, but it leaves lessons written in fire." Jonathan clenched his fists, swearing quietly, "This war isn't over." His eyes burned, no longer with ambition, but with vengeance. The narrator said, Jonathan Hale was no longer defending, he was striking. He stormed into the boardroom with fire in his eyes. Richard Cole smirked and said, "You look like a man who has already lost." Jonathan growled, "I built this empire from blood and dust. I will bury you in it." Rebecca Clark whispered coldly, "The board doesn't want you anymore." The narrator said, "War was no longer hidden. It sat across polished tables, waged with words as sharp as blades." Jonathan slammed contracts down, daring them to strip his throne. The narrator said, "The war spilled beyond walls into markets and headlines." Jonathan Hale launched counteroffers, stealing investors back. Richard Cole snarled, "You're bleeding cash." Jonathan replied, "Better to bleed than rot." Rebecca Clark said, "You can't buy loyalty. It's already sold." The narrator said, "Every news ticker became a battlefield, every shareholder a soldier to be swayed." Jonathan fought not with armies, but with numbers, forcing his rival into desperate moves. The narrator said, "But Jonathan's war revealed a greater hand in play." A shadowed figure watched from a distance. Margaret Vance, the hidden investor. Margaret whispered, "Both are pawns in my game." Jonathan confronted her later, saying, "You've been pulling strings." Margaret smiled coldly, "And you only just noticed." The narrator said, "Every empire believes it rules itself until the invisible hand closes around its throat." Jonathan realized he was not battling rivals, but an empire far larger, hidden behind one face. The narrator said, "Jonathan Hale fought on every front, markets, boardrooms, and shadows." Richard Cole said, "You can't fight us all." Jonathan growled, "I only need to fight harder than all of you combined." Rebecca Clark smirked, "You've already lost your allies." Jonathan struck back with data, revealing corruption tied to Richard. The narrator said, "Truth became Jonathan's weapon, though truth can cut its wielder too." The board gasped, balance shifting once again in the storm. The narrator said, "Victory in war is never free. It comes drenched in blood, even if unseen." Jonathan Hale staggered into his office after the board's uproar. Rebecca Clark followed, saying, "Even if you win, Jonathan, you will be alone." Jonathan whispered, "Alone," I began. "Alone. I'll finish." The narrator said, "The war for power stripped him of every bond, leaving only the fire of vengeance to carry him forward." Jonathan stared at the skyline, not as a ruler, but as a survivor clawing back through ruin. The narrator said, "The storm gathered for its final strike." Jonathan Hale entered the grand boardroom, shoulders squared, eyes hardened. Richard Cole smirked, "Your empire ends today." Rebecca Clark avoided his gaze, guilt shadowing her face. Margaret Vance whispered, "Every game ends where it began, with choice." Jonathan's voice thundered, "I am not finished until I decide." The narrator said, "The battlefield was not steel or stone, but oak and glass. Here crowns would be stripped not with blood, but with signatures." The war was reaching its apex. The narrator said, "Words became weapons sharper than steel." Richard Cole shouted, "You gambled everything and lost." Jonathan Hale replied, "I built what you now steal. You inherit ruins." Rebecca Clark said softly, "Jonathan, it didn't have to end like this." Jonathan turned to her and growled, "You chose betrayal, and betrayal never ends in peace." Margaret Vance leaned forward and said, "Gentlemen, the empire is mine now." The narrator said, "It was not a duel but a hunt. and Jonathan was the last wolf standing against the pack. The narrator said, the climax was not silence but explosion. Jonathan Hale revealed hidden files showing Richard's corruption. Gasps filled the room. Richard shouted, "Lies!" Jonathan growled, "The only lie was believing you could bury me." Rebecca Clark whispered, "He has proof." Margaret Vance smiled faintly and said, "Impressive, but the board already chose its future." The narrator said truth roared, but power had already been purchased. Jonathan realized that justice had no throne here. The narrator said, "Defeat often comes dressed in applause." The board voted, hands raised in Jonathan's absence of favor. Richard Cole grinned with victory. Rebecca Clark whispered, "Jonathan, I never wanted this." Jonathan answered, "Want or not, you chose it." Margaret Vance said calmly, "The empire is reborn without its creator." The narrator said, "Every crown must fall, but not every king bows." Jonathan stood silent as the walls he built stripped him of his throne. The narrator said, "Empires fall, but legends rise in ruins." Jonathan Hale walked from the building into the rain, stripped of title but not of fire. Reporters shouted questions, he ignored them. Rebecca Clark called after him, but he did not turn. Richard Cole celebrated inside, blind to how fragile his new throne already was. Margaret Vance whispered, "Another piece removed from the board." The narrator said Jonathan Hale lost everything, yet in his eyes burned something greater, vengeance sharpened by betrayal. The reckoning was not an ending, but the calm before another storm.